The final shovel of dirt fell with a hollow thud, a sound of grim finality that echoed the closing of a door. Ilara stood beside the fresh grave, a girl of 17 winters who now stood utterly alone. The cold November wind whipped strands of brown hair across her face, stinging her cheeks like a swarm of icy needles. Her mother was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through Providence Creek with the merciless efficiency of a wildfire. The small crowd of neighbors, their faces etched with practiced sympathy, had already begun to disperse, their duty done. They retreated to the warmth of their hearths, leaving Ilara in the company of the tombstones and the wind. Her stepfather, Marcus, remained. He was a man built of hard angles and harder silences, his face a mask of indifference. He had not shed a tear. He looked at Ilara, his eyes flat and gray as river stones. He reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch that jingled with the pathetic sound of a few coins. He pressed it into her hand. His fingers were cold and dry. "This is what is left," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. He then produced a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "And this, your mother's folly, her inheritance from her own father. It's yours now. The law is clear on that." Ilara unfolded the paper. It was a deed, the ink faded but the words still legible. It granted ownership of a small plot of land 2 days' walk to the north, a place known to the locals as Blackwood Sump. She looked up at him, confusion clouding her grief. "I don't understand," she whispered, the words snatched away by the wind. "The house is mine," Marcus stated, as if explaining a simple sum. "The law is clear on that, too. I have no need of a daughter who is not my own. You are of age. You will make your own way." He did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, his broad back a wall of finality. He did not look back. The door to her childhood home, the only home she had ever known, was now closed to her forever. She was an orphan, an outcast, with a handful of coins and a worthless deed. She clutched the paper in the pouch, the cold seeping through her thin wool coat, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of absolute abandonment. The community of Providence Creek, a town that prided itself on Christian charity, watched her from behind their curtains. They saw a problem, a burden to be managed. They pitied her, but pity was a thin gruel that offered no real sustenance. Her feet carried her, numb and unfeeling, to the one place that served as the town's heart, Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt like a mockery. Mr. Gable, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, stood behind the counter polishing a glass jar. He was the town's purveyor of goods and its most trusted source of conventional wisdom. He looked at Ilara, his expression softening into one of condescending sympathy. "Child," he said, his voice a low rumble, a sad day indeed. Your mother was a good woman." Ilara said nothing. She placed the deed on the worn wooden counter. Mr. Gable picked it up, adjusted his spectacles, and read it. A slow, pitying smile spread across his face. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Blackwood Sump," he said, shaking his head. "Lord have mercy. Marcus gave you this? That's no land, girl. It's a hole. A collapsed foundation from some poor fool's attempt to build out there 50 years ago. Fills with black water every spring thaw and stays that way. Nothing grows but cattails and misery. It's worthless." He pushed the deed back toward her. "Listen to me," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Your best course is to take what little coin you have and buy a coach ticket to the city. Find work in a factory, or the workhouse. There's nothing for you here, and there is certainly less than nothing for you at that sump." Ilara looked at the man's face, at the certainty in his eyes. She saw the town's judgment reflected there. She was doomed, a piece of driftwood to be swept away by the current. A quiet, cold fury began to burn in her chest, a single hot coal in the frozen landscape of her grief. It was the first warmth she had felt all day. She pushed the deed into her pocket. She placed the small pouch of coins on the counter. "I'll not be needing a ticket," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'll need a good axe, a shovel, a sturdy knife, a bag of salt, and a flint and steel." Mr. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He saw the resolve in her eyes, a hardness that did not belong in the face of a 17-year-old girl. He saw that she was not asking for advice. He sighed, the sound of a man witnessing a tragedy he was powerless to prevent. He gathered the items, his movements slow and deliberate. The total consumed almost every coin she had. She took the tools, the heavy axe head balanced in one hand, the shovel over her shoulder. She turned and walked out of the mercantile, the bell announcing her departure. She did not look back at the faces in the windows, at the town that had already written her off. She turned her back on Providence Creek and began to walk north, toward the worthless land that was now her only inheritance. The weight of the tools was a comfort, a tangible promise of the hard work that lay ahead. It was all she had left. The journey was a punishment. The path that led from Providence Creek started as a well-worn wagon track, but it soon dwindled to a deer trail, and then to nothing at all. Elara pushed through dense, tangled undergrowth that clawed at her coat and scratched her face. The land grew steadily lower, the air damper, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Each step was an effort, the shovel and axe a constant, shifting burden on her shoulders. The world grew quiet, the sounds of the town replaced by the cawing of crows and the rustle of unseen things in the woods. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. By the end of the second day, her muscles screamed in protest, and her spirit was worn thin. She followed the crude map drawn on the back of the deed, her eyes scanning for the landmarks it described. A split oak, a ridge of granite. Finally, as the sun began to bleed through the skeletal trees, she found it. She stepped into a clearing, and her heart sank like a stone in deep water. Before her lay a scene of absolute desolation. It was exactly as Mr. Gable had described. A rectangular depression in the earth, lined with the crumbling remains of a stone foundation. The entire basin was filled with dark, still water, the color of black tea. A few skeletal trees rose from the water itself, their branches stark and lifeless against the gray sky. The ground around the edge was a soggy marsh, sucking at her boots. It was a grave, a drowned ruin, a place of utter hopelessness. She dropped her tools. The axe clattered against a rock. She sank to her knees on the damp ground, the cold seeping into her bones. The town was right. Marcus was right. Her mother's folly. Tears she had refused to shed at the funeral now burned hot in her eyes, freezing on her cheeks. This was not a home. It was an ending. Despair, a physical and crushing weight, settled over her. For a long, silent moment, she believed she had come here only to die. She stayed there as the light faded, the world dissolving into shades of gray and black. The temperature plummeted. A bitter wind began to rise, moaning through the bare trees. She shivered, pulling her thin coat tighter. It was then, in the depths of her despair, that she noticed something strange. The wind whipped across the clearing, but the surface of the dark water in the sump remained oddly calm, almost glassy. She crawled closer, her hands sinking into the cold mud. She held her palm just above the water's surface. The air there was still, and it was less cold. Driven by a flicker of desperate curiosity, she dipped her fingers into the water. She braced for a shock of icy cold, but it never came. The water was cool, certainly, but it was not the biting, painful cold of the creek water near town. It felt alive. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw a faint, almost imperceptible movement beneath the surface. A slow, lazy swirl. Then, a sudden electric flash of silver as something turned in the depths. And then another. She stared, her breath held tight in her chest. Fish. The water was full of them. She plunged her hand in deeper, down toward the bottom. She felt a gentle, persistent current. The water wasn't stagnant. It was being fed from below, from a deep, subterranean spring that was insulated from the surface frost by the earth itself. The collapsed cellar hadn't created a swamp. It had breached a natural artesian well. The surrounding stone foundation acted as a basin, a perfect, sheltered container. It was not a drowned cellar. It was a pond. A living, spring-fed pond, protected from the wind and insulated from the worst of the cold. A larder. A life source. The despair that had gripped her began to recede, replaced by a grim, fierce resolve. The town saw a worthless hole. She saw a chance. It was a small chance, a desperate one, but it was hers. She picked up her axe, the wood of the handle feeling solid and real in her trembling hand. The work would be brutal, but she was still there. The first task was shelter. She could not live in the water, but she could live beside it, drawing on its strange, subtle warmth. The original builders had left her a gift, a scattered quarry of foundation stones. Her first days were a blur of agonizing labor. She used the fallen timbers of the old structure as levers, prying the heavy, moss-covered stones from the muck. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic chores, were quickly rubbed raw. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving her palms a mess of raw, burning skin. She ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. Each stone was a victory. She hauled them one by one to a spot on the slightly higher ground at the northern edge of the sump, stacking them into a low, crude wall. Her back screamed, her muscles burned with a fire that never went out, and at night she would collapse onto a bed of pine boughs, exhaustion so deep it felt like a kind of numbness. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until her arms would no longer obey her commands in the deepening twilight. She needed a roof. She turned her attention to the trees surrounding the clearing. Choosing a straight, slender pine, she began to chop. The axe felt clumsy and monstrously heavy in her hands. Her first swings glanced off the bark, jarring her arms to the shoulder. She gritted her teeth, remembering how her father had taught her years ago, before he died. Let the weight of the axe do the work. Find a rhythm. She chopped and chopped, the rhythmic thud of steel on wood becoming the new sound of her world. When the tree finally groaned, cracked, and fell with a ground-shaking crash, she let out a cry that was half triumph and half exhaustion. Getting the log to her shelter was another monumental task. She cut it into shorter lengths, rolling and dragging each piece, her boots slipping in the mud. It took her a week to gather enough logs to form a crude framework for a roof. She laid them across her low stone walls, lashing them together with rope she painstakingly wove from fibrous roots. For the roof itself, she cut thick squares of sod from the forest floor, layering them over a lattice of branches. It was heavy, ugly, and imperfect, but it was a roof. Next came heat. She built a small fireplace against the back wall of her shelter, using the flattest stones she could find. She discovered a deposit of rich, sticky clay near the edge of the sump, and mixed it with dry grass to create a crude mortar, packing it into the gaps between the stones. Her first attempt at a chimney was a failure. Smoke filled the tiny hovel, choking her and stinging her eyes until she scrambled out into the cold air, gasping. She tore it down and rebuilt it, making the flue wider and taller. On the night she finally got a fire to draw properly, she sat huddled in its glow, the flickering light dancing on the rough stone walls. It was the first true warmth she had felt in weeks. The small, contained fire was a victory against the vast, encroaching cold. It was a declaration. She was here to stay. With a roof over her head and a fire at her back, she turned her full attention to the sump itself. It was her larder, her singular advantage. She used her knife to cut long, flexible willow branches, and spent her evenings by the fire, weaving them into a crude net. Her first attempts to fish were clumsy. She cast the net again and again, pulling it up empty or with only a few small, finger-length trout. She learned to be patient, to watch the water, to see the patterns of shadow and light where the larger fish lurked. Her greatest innovation was born of necessity. She needed a way to store fish, to keep them alive and accessible. She began building a smaller wall of stones within the main pond, sectioning off a corner. She painstakingly created a small, enclosed pool, a natural corral. Using her net, she would catch the smaller, younger fish and transfer them to this protected area, where they could grow without fear of predators and be easily caught when she needed them. She was no longer just a hunter. She was a farmer, a fish farmer. Weeks turned into a month. A stray dog, a scruffy mix of breeds with one ear that flopped and another that stood straight up, wandered into her camp. He was rail-thin, his ribs stark beneath his matted fur. He watched her with wary, intelligent eyes. Elara had little to spare, but she grilled a small fish over her fire and tossed it to him. He devoured it in seconds. He did not leave. That night, he curled up just outside the entrance to her hovel. The next morning, he was still there. She named him Silas. He became her shadow, her companion, her alarm system. His presence was a quiet comfort in the profound solitude, a warm body to lean against in the cold nights. He was the first living creature in this new life that had not judged or abandoned her. She knew she needed more than just fish to survive the winter. She needed vegetables that would keep. With the last of her coins, she and Silas made the long journey back to Providence Creek. Her arrival caused a stir. Whispers followed her down the main street. "It's the Sump girl," they murmured. "Still alive, is she?" The children stared, their parents pulling them away as if she were a ghost. The derisive nickname stung, but she held her head high and walked directly to Gable's mercantile. Mr. Gable's eyes widened when she entered, Silas at her heels. He looked her over. Her clothes were tattered and stained with mud. Her face was thin, but her eyes were clear and direct. He had expected to see a broken, begging creature. He did not. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, still breathing. "I need supplies," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She did not ask for credit or charity. She placed her remaining coins, a pitifully small pile, on the counter. A cast-iron pot, a proper fishing net, hooks and line, and a sack of potatoes and turnips. Gable looked at the list, then at the coins, and then back at her. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound pity on his face. "Potatoes? Girl, you can't farm a swamp. Nothing will grow in that sour ground. You're wasting your last dollar on a fool's hope." "I'll take the risk," Elara said flatly. He sighed and gathered her items. He felt a strange, unwilling flicker of respect mixed with his certainty of her doom. He watched her lead her dog out of the town, the heavy sack of vegetables slung over her shoulder, heading back to the place everyone knew was uninhabitable. "The Lord looks after fools and children," he said to the empty store. "I pray he's looking after that one." Back at the sump, Ilara did not try to plant in the soggy ground. She spent another back-breaking week hauling richer, darker soil from a wooded ridge half a mile away, carrying it back in buckets she fashioned from bark. She built a raised garden bed, lining it with rocks to keep it from washing away, and filled it with the good soil. There, she carefully planted the potatoes and turnips. She channeled water from the spring to irrigate it. It was a small patch of order in a world of chaos. She spent the last days of autumn in a fever of preparation. She smoked and salted fish, hanging them from the rafters of her hovel until the air was thick with their scent. She reinforced the sod roof, packing mud and moss into every crevice. She built a small, lean-to shelter for Silas against the outer wall, near the warmth of the chimney. She stockpiled firewood until a massive stack stood taller than she was. Her world shrank to the rhythms of survival. Chop wood, tend the fire, check the fish, mend the net, weed the garden. She worked until she was too tired to feel the loneliness, until the physical reality of her tasks crowded out the ghosts of her past. She was not just surviving, she was building. The mockery from Providence Creek did not cease. It became a kind of local folklore. Trappers who passed near her land would sometimes detour to catch a glimpse of the Sump Girl and her mud hut. They would see her from a distance, a small, solitary figure tending her fire or her strange water farm, and they would return to town with stories that grew with each telling. They said she lived in a hole like a badger, that she spoke to the fish, that she was slowly losing her mind in the wilderness. The name, the Folly Girl, became as common as Sump Girl, a constant reminder of her mother's supposed mistake and her own stubborn refusal to fail. Mr. Gable was often the conductor of this chorus of doubt. "A girl can't live like that," he would proclaim to the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove in his store. "It's against nature. She's got no walls to speak of, no proper larder. When the deep freeze comes, that pond of hers will freeze solid to the bottom. She'll starve or freeze before Christmas. It's a tragedy, is what it is. A tragedy of pride." One afternoon, a hunter named Brant, a man known for his arrogance, decided to visit her directly. He strode into her clearing with his rifle over his shoulder, Silas barking furiously at his approach. Ilara came out of her hovel, her hand resting on the handle of her axe. Brant looked at her small shelter, at the steaming pond, and laughed. "They say you're living out here," he said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "I see they weren't lying. That's a sorry excuse for a home, girl. A good wind will take that roof, and a hard freeze will kill your fish. You should have listened to Gable. Your pride will be the death of you." Ilara looked at him, her face impassive. She said nothing. She simply stared, her silence more unnerving than any angry retort. Brant shifted uncomfortably, his bluster faltering in the face of her quiet self-possession. He shrugged and turned away, heading back to the woods. "Don't come crying to us when you're starving," he called over his shoulder. As autumn deepened into winter, the world began to close in. The first snows fell, blanketing the landscape in a soft, white silence. Ilara's life settled into a deep, monastic routine. Each morning she would wake in the cold darkness of the hovel, the embers of the fire glowing like dull, red eyes. Her first task was always the fire, coaxing it back to life with dry kindling until its warmth began to push back the chill. She would then take her bucket and walk to the edge of the sump. A thin sheet of ice would sometimes form around the very edges, but the center, above the spring, always remained open, a dark, steaming mirror in the frozen world. This was the miracle of her home, a fact that defied the logic of the men in town. Her days were measured by tasks. She would check the fish in her stone corral, breaking the thin ice at the edges to drop in dried insects and algae she had collected. She would check the snares she had set in the woods, occasionally finding a rabbit, a welcome addition of meat to her diet. She would spend hours mending her net by the firelight, her fingers growing deft and sure. She dug up the last of her potatoes and turnips, storing them in a small pit she had lined with stones and straw inside the hovel. The small world she had built was ordered and functional. The warmth of the fire, the sound of Silas's steady breathing, the miracle of the living water just outside her door. These were the pillars of her existence. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not helpless. She was the sovereign of her small, stone-walled kingdom. Before the great crisis arrived, a smaller test came to prove her systems. A week of heavy, freezing rain fell, followed by a sudden thaw. The forest floor, unable to absorb the moisture, turned to a sea of mud and runoff. A torrent of brown water poured down into her clearing, threatening to flood her hovel and wash away her garden. For 2 days and nights, she fought the water, digging frantic trenches with her shovel, diverting the flow around her shelter and away from her raised beds. She worked until she was soaked through and shivering, her muscles screaming. But her trenches held. Her shelter stayed dry. Her garden was saved. The flood receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris. She had held her ground. The test had proven her preparations were sound. It was a hard-won victory that solidified her confidence. Then, in the heart of January, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and the wind fell utterly silent. An unnatural stillness settled over the world. Even the crows were quiet. Cellar felt a prickle of unease. Silas paced restlessly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. That night, the blizzard of '83 arrived. It did not come like a normal storm. It came like a hammer, a sudden, violent explosion of wind and snow that shook her small hovel to its foundation. The wind shrieked like a living thing, a predator clawing at her walls, seeking a way in. Snow, as fine and hard as sand, drove into every tiny crevice. The world outside her door vanished, replaced by a churning, white chaos. Inside, Cellar stoked the fire, the stones of her fireplace radiating a steady, life-giving heat. The sounds of the storm were terrifying, but her walls held. The pond steamed in the maelstrom, a defiant patch of life in a world descending into a frozen death. She was not fighting the storm, she was simply outside its reach. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. When it finally passed, it left behind a world transformed. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, burying fences and swallowing entire trees. And behind the snow came the cold. It was a deep, penetrating freeze, a cold so profound it felt like the absence of God. The temperature dropped far below zero and stayed there. The sun was a pale, useless disk in a white sky. In Providence Creek, the community's confidence shattered. Their sturdy, well-built wooden houses, designed for ordinary winters, were no match for this. The cold seeped through the walls like a thief. Firewood, stockpiled for a normal season, was devoured at an alarming rate. Soon, families were burning furniture to stay warm. The creek, the town's lifeline, froze solid, a ribbon of impenetrable ice. The town well froze next. Livestock, trapped in unheated barns, began to die, their frozen bodies a testament to the storm's ferocity. The carefully preserved stores in cellars and pantries began to run out. The town's hunters, including the boastful Brant, could find no game. The animals were either frozen in their burrows or had fled to deeper shelter. Hunger, a wolf they had never truly known, began to stalk the streets of Providence Creek. The community's conventional wisdom had failed. Their preparations, built on the assumption that the future would resemble the past, had collapsed. The town was freezing, starving, and terrified. But in the hovel beside Blackwood Sump, life continued. Elara's shelter, banked high with insulating snow, was snug and warm. Her fire burned steadily, fed by her enormous woodpile. The spring-fed pond, her great secret, steamed in the bitter air, its core refusing to freeze. She pulled sleek, healthy trout from her stone corral, their flesh a rich source of protein and fat. She had her potatoes and turnips. She and Silas were warm. They were fed. The contrast between her small, thriving world and the dying town was absolute. She had built not for a normal winter, but for the worst winter, and the worst winter had come. One afternoon, nearly a week into the deep freeze, Silas began to bark, a frantic, urgent sound. Elara peered through a small gap in her door. A figure was stumbling through the massive snowdrifts, a dark shape against the blinding white. The person was moving slowly, collapsing every few steps, a desperate, failing pilgrimage. Elara grabbed her axe and pulled on her thickest wraps. She opened the door, the brutal cold hitting her like a physical blow. She waded out into the deep snow, Silas bounding ahead. As she drew closer, she recognized the figure. It was Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of ice and frozen tears, his fine wool coat offering little protection against the elemental fury of the cold. He saw her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. He took one more step and collapsed face down in the snow. Elara and Silas dragged him back to the hovel. The warmth inside was a shock to his system. She pulled off his frozen gloves and boots, his skin a deathly white underneath. She sat him by the fire, wrapped him in her own spare blanket, and ladled hot fish broth from the iron pot into a mug, forcing it into his trembling hands. He drank it greedily, the warmth slowly returning to his core. For a long time, he could only shiver and stare. He looked around the small, warm space, at the neat rows of smoked fish hanging from the rafters, at the pile of potatoes in the corner, at the steady, cheerful fire. His gaze drifted to the doorway, through which he could see the impossible sight of open, steaming water. He, the wisest man in town, was freezing to death. The foolish girl in the swamp was living in warmth and plenty. "My granddaughter," he finally choked out, his voice a raw whisper. "Little Sarah. She has the fever, the same that took your mother. We have no food, no firewood left to speak of. The doctor says if her fever doesn't break, she won't last the night without warmth and food." He looked at Elara, his pride utterly broken, his eyes pleading. "Help us." Elara looked at the man who had mocked her, who had led the town in dismissing her as a fool. She remembered the sting of his pity, the certainty of his pronouncements of her doom. She looked at her carefully rationed stores, the fish that were her key to surviving the rest of the winter, the wood that was her shield against the cold. Helping him meant risking herself. It meant depleting the very resources that kept her alive. The bitter memory of his scorn warred with the sight of his desperation. The choice was clear. It was not a choice born of forgiveness, not yet. It was simpler than that. She had food, and a child was starving. She had warmth, and a community was freezing. She could help. Therefore she must. This was the unwritten law of the wilderness, a law more fundamental than any town ordinance. She stood up without a word. She began to pack a crude sled she had built from saplings and hide. She loaded it with a generous pile of smoked fish, a sack of potatoes, and, most precious of all, a large bundle of dry, seasoned firewood. Mr. Gable watched her, his eyes welling with tears of shame and gratitude. "The path is gone," he stammered. "The drifts. I barely made it here. I don't know if we can make it back." "Silas knows the way," Elara said, her first words to him since he had collapsed. She strapped on the snowshoes she had fashioned from bent branches and sinew. She harnessed Silas to the front of the sled. She looked at Gable. "Can you walk?" He nodded, pulling himself to his feet. He was weak, but her broth and the fire had restored some of his strength. Together, they stepped out into the brutal, frozen world. Ilara led the way, her snowshoes keeping her atop the deep drifts. Silas, a creature of instinct and loyalty, pulled the sled with a steady strength, finding the path where none existed. The journey back to Providence Creek was a waking nightmare. The wind cut like a knife, and the cold was a constant, pressing enemy. But Ilara did not falter. She was a creature of this new, hard world. She moved through it with a purpose that the freezing, desperate man stumbling behind her could only marvel at. When they finally reached the edge of Providence Creek, it was like arriving in a ghost town. No smoke rose from the chimneys. The silence was profound and terrifying. They went straight to Mr. Gable's house, the largest in town. Inside, his family was huddled together under a mountain of blankets, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Little Sarah lay pale and still, her breathing shallow. Ilara did not wait for thanks. She immediately set to work, building a fire in the hearth with the wood she had brought. The flames caught, and a wave of life-giving heat began to spread through the room. She put a pot on to boil and began making a nourishing fish soup. As the warmth and the smell of food filled the house, other townspeople, drawn by the impossible sight of smoke from Gable's chimney, began to appear at the door. Their faces were pinched with cold and hunger. Among them was Brant, the hunter, his arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. They stared at Ilara, then at the food, then at the fire. They looked at the sled, piled high with provisions. They saw the girl they had called a fool, the girl they had mocked and dismissed, single-handedly bringing salvation to their door. The shock was a palpable thing in the room. They could not reconcile the sump girl of their stories with this competent, resolute woman who moved with such quiet efficiency. They saw the warmth radiating from the fireplace she had built. They smelled the food she was cooking, and they felt the depth of their own failure. Mr. Gable, his granddaughter now stirring with a flicker of life as the warmth reached her, turned to Ilara. His face, illuminated by the fire she had provided, was a canvas of shame and awe. He looked at the other townspeople, his neighbors who had shared in his mockery. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick and cracking. It was not an apology. It was a confession, spoken to the entire room. "We called you a fool. We laughed at your work. My God." He shook his head, looking directly at Ilara. "We were the fools. All of us. You didn't just survive. You prepared. You saw what we couldn't see." Brant the hunter shuffled his feet, unable to meet her gaze. "He's right," he muttered to the floor. "We thought we were masters of the woods. We knew nothing." Ilara looked at their humbled faces, at the hunger and fear in their eyes. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction in their admission. Vengeance was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Her victory was not in their defeat, but in the simple fact of the simmering pot, the blazing fire, the child who was now breathing a little easier. She simply nodded. "There is food," she said, her voice calm and even. "Eat. Keep the children warm. There is more at my camp. I will bring it tomorrow." Her grace was more stunning than any accusation would have been. She did not demand they grovel. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply provided. She fed them fish soup from her own pot, sharing the bounty of her worthless land. In that moment, she was not the town's outcast. She was its anchor. Her quiet strength, forged in solitude and hardship, was now the community's only hope. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a character strong enough to offer mercy to those who had shown her none. When the great freeze finally broke, Providence Creek was a town transformed. The immediate aftermath was one of quiet industry. People did not return to their old ways. They came to Alara, not with pity, but with respect. They came to Blackwood Sump, which no one ever called by that name again. It became Elara's Spring, or simply the Spring. They brought tools, cloth, seeds, and livestock to trade for her smoked fish and for her knowledge. Mr. Gable became her most ardent student and advocate. He helped her build a larger, more permanent smokehouse. Brant, the humbled hunter, taught her how to properly tan hides in exchange for lessons on how to read the subtle signs of the deep woods. The women of the town, who had once whispered about the Sump Girl, now came to her for advice on preserving food and for the potatoes she grew in her miraculous raised beds. The derisive nickname was not just retired, it was erased, a source of collective shame. The impact on the town was profound and lasting. The following summer, the sound of hammers rang through the valley, not just for repairs, but for improvements. New root cellars were dug deeper. The foundations of houses were banked with sod and stone, mimicking the design of Elara's hovel. People began to look at the landscape differently, seeing not just timber and farmland, but resources to be understood: springs, clay deposits, sheltered hollows. The community didn't just recover, it became more resilient, its collective wisdom rewritten by the hard-won experience of a 17-year-old girl they had cast out. Elara's story spread beyond Providence Creek. Travelers and trappers carried the tale of the starving winter and the girl at the spring who had saved a town. Her methods, born of desperation and ingenuity, became a new kind of frontier knowledge, passed from one settlement to the next. Her shelter became a quiet landmark, a testament to the idea that true strength lay not in conventional structures, but in adapting to the world as it was. The landscape itself bore the mark of her legacy, in the smarter, hardier homesteads that began to dot the surrounding hills. Years later, Elara stood by the edge of her spring-fed pond. Her home was no longer a tiny hovel, but a sturdy, expanded cottage of stone and timber, with a real glass window that looked out over the water. Silas, now gray around the muzzle, lay sleeping in a patch of sun by the door. Her garden was larger, her flock of chickens pecked in a fenced-in yard, and a small, hardy goat chewed contentedly on a bush. She was not a wealthy woman in the way the world measured such things, but she was rich in all the ways that mattered. She had warmth, she had food, and she had the deep, abiding respect of the community that had once thrown her away. She watched the flash of silver in the dark water, the same sight that had sparked hope in her on that first desperate night. She had not conquered the wilderness. She had not bent it to her will. She had simply listened to it, learned its rhythms, and accepted its gifts. In the town's most despised and worthless corner, in a drowned cellar that everyone else had seen as a grave, she had found not just survival. She had built a life. Her story became a quiet lesson passed down through generations, that the greatest value is often hidden in what is discarded, and that the strongest foundations are built not of pride, but of resilience, courage, and the quiet grace to forgive.